Okay, good afternoon, everybody. And we're going to carry on our discussion about the vertebrates. This is where I finished off in class, was telling you about the rays and the sharks of the class Chondrichthyes. And these are the cartilaginous fish. It used to be thought that the possession of cartilage was a primitive condition, and that later on this got elaborated into bone. It turns out that is not, in fact, true. It is quite probable that all the fishes evolved a bony skeleton, but that this particular group, Chondrichthyes, actually gave up the calcium salts impregnation, which gives us the solid bony skeleton, and instead they use a cartilaginous skeleton. It's a locomotory adaptation. In any case, we leave them behind, and we're going to proceed now to this group called the Osteichthyes. And well, ichthyes means fish, and ostei means bony. So these are the bony fish. Well, that's fine. Yes, there are certainly bony fish in there, but look who else is in the group. Look down here. I've boxed the whole. It's a clade, and it's called the Osteichthyes, and it includes all of the rest of the vertebrates, including us. And that's why I said to you that phylogeneticists would regard us, the human being, as being a very advanced fish, which in some ways is certainly true, as we'll find out. So what we refer to as the fish are actually the aquatic Osteichthyes, and they are divided into two broad groups: the class Actinopterygia, which are the ray-finned fish, the most familiar to us, and then this very important clade called the Sarcopterygia, the lobe-finned fishes. And we are going to see that all of the rest of the vertebrates are closely related to this group here in the Sarcopterygia called the lungfish. So that is going to be the story of the evolution of the vertebrates from now on in. And when we look at these groups, just have a look here. Here is the whole grouping of the gnathostomes there, those animals with jaws. And the jaws and the mineralized skeleton, etc., there is the derived character, which gives this whole group its definition. And within this group, here is the Osteichthyes group here. There it is there, the Osteichthyes, and look what the derived character is. The derived character is the lung, or a lung derivative, maybe a highly modified lung. But when we look at the first group, the Actinopterygia, which are the ray-finned fishes, the most diverse group of all, we see that they almost all have a swim bladder. This is, in fact, what evolution has worked upon to develop the lung. And it is a characteristic of this entire group that, except in specialized cases where it has been lost, they all have a lung, something like a swim bladder, or elaborated into a lung. That is, I know it sounds like a strange linking character, but it's just that is it. So we sit in this group with all of these strange relatives. And the Actinopterygia here, they are most familiar fishes to us, of course, because they are so attractive, so diverse, so interesting, and so delicious. And these are the ray-finned fishes, very numerate group. There's over 27,000 species and more get discovered the whole time. And they are a very old, ancient group of vertebrates They arose during the Silurian period, which is about 450 million years ago, somewhere around about there. And they've become extremely diverse, occupying many different habitats, all of them aquatic. So, and they actually evolved in freshwater and diversified into marine habitats. So almost all the adaptations which we see on the outside are adaptations for locomotion or adaptations for feeding. And many and various they are. So the other group of fish bony fish that we would talk about are these. There's the class Sarcopterygia. They're also called the lobe-finned fishes. And they're divided into two subclasses. They are the Actinopterygia, which are the coelacanths, and the class Dipnoe, which are the lungfishes. So there are two really important things about this group which make them of interest to us in evolutionary terms. The first is they have a completely different fin structure to the ray-finned fishes. The ray-finned fishes have many, many bones that make up a fin, and they are arranged in a fan-like fashion to create a swimming surface. The Sarcopterygia have a completely different kind of arrangement. They have far fewer bones, and they are arranged in a particular pattern, which will become really familiar to us once we start looking at more advanced lobe-finned fishes. So they once were a really big, important group, but there was a sudden decrease in their diversity and everything. They were probably being outcompeted by the ray-finned fish. But there are two surviving groups, which we see. The first are the coelacanths. Now, the coelacanths are really interesting because they're well represented. Here's one here, well represented in the fossil record. And they have four important fin structures, two at the front and two at the back. So that immediately should set bells ringing, that they've got four of these. Here you can see here. This is a living coelacanth. The coelacanths we thought were extinct, but then they were rediscovered in very deep water, first of all off South Africa, but now widely across the Indian Ocean particularly. They have been found. They're still rare, but even living ones have been observed, as you can see here. So those are the coelacanths. What is particularly interesting for us about the coelacanth is the structure of this fin, of this lobed fin. The other group that we need to pay attention to are the lungfishes, and they're aptly named, as I'll show you in a minute. And this group called the Dipnoe, they also have these four strange fin structures, and both the coelacanth and the lobe-finned fish have been observed using these lobed fins to actually locomote across the bottom. So that is another thing which should spark our interest. In other words, these fins are not used so much for swimming as they are in the ray-finned fish. They are almost pre-adapted for interacting with substrate. So all of the rest of the vertebrates, the whole group which we're going to see are the tetrapods. They have all evolved from these ancestral forms, which currently we see the remnants of in the coelacanths and the lungfishes. But the ancestral form probably had structures very similar to these. So have a look here. This, first of all, there's our arm, okay, with the humerus and the radius ulna and et cetera, et cetera. you'll see that it's completely different to a ray fin fish. Ray fin fish, they just have these long, bony spines which support the fin structure. The lobe fin fish, like the coelacanth, has a completely different structure, and here it is here. They have these stout bones which go down the fin. That is what gives it its lobe structure. At the end, the coelacanths, at least, do have a fin, a fringing fin structure there, but it's supported by these bones here. And these bones are primordial. They, in evolutionary terms, have been adapted. So, for example, here is the humerus here, radius and ulna, metacarpals and carpals, all are present in a primitive form in that lobed fin. So that's the first thing. The second thing is when we go to the lungfish, their lobe fins have been very highly modified. They are long and thin, and they don't look like this. We don't see we see the bony pattern in them, but it's a bit more difficult to make out. But what's really interesting for us in the lungfish is that they have a true lung. It's not as elaborate as our lungs, but it functions as a lung. And in fact, the lungfish have two circulatory systems. They still have gills, like all the other fishes. They have gills which have water bathed around them, which have their own circulatory system. As long as the lungfish is in water with plenty of oxygen, that is the circulatory system that operates. It just gets its oxygen from the gills, also gets through the skin as well to a certain extent. If oxygen becomes depleted in the water, as it happens like when the water, they live in freshwater ponds. The freshwater pond gets hot. The oxygen levels plummet, and you'll see the lungfish coming up to the surface to take great gulps of air. And when they do so, they switch on another circulatory pathway, which goes through the lungs. They can run these together, but if they are entirely deprived of water or entirely deprived of oxygen and have to just depend on the air to breathe, they can do so. And what they do is they switch off the gill circulation and they switch on the lung circulation entirely. During a lot of these occur, for instance, in Africa, and during the long dry winters, which is the weather pattern in most of Africa, the ponds dry out, and the fish actually build themselves like a cocoon that they live in, and they are actually able to carry on breathing air. They don't do it as efficiently as other vertebrates, but they can do so. And here lie the origins of the whole group that we call the tetrapods, those animals with 4 limbs, which breathe with a lung. It's right here in this particular group. And in fact, most phylogenists regard us as being advanced lobe-fin fish. So because the tetrapods, basically, we are gnathostomes, we have jaws that we eat with, but we have limbs. This is a characteristic. But those limbs, in actual fact, are not that different to many of the advanced lobe-fin fish that we see in the fossil record. And very late, by about 365 million years ago, the true limbs had begun to evolve. This is a fish-like tetrapod. It's sometimes called a fishapod. And this is Tiktaalik. It's a very famous fossil. It has many, many characteristics which look fish-like, excepting that it also has what truly look like limbs. They wouldn't have functioned very well on dry land, but they would have been sufficient to support this organism in very shallow water or on muddy close to the water. There are some other things about it. It has its eyes on top of its skull, an adaptation for being in the air, for seeing in air above it. They have strong shoulder bones. Now that's really interesting because that suggests that they are becoming modified for pressing weight in opposition to gravity. This Tiktaalik is, we believe, typical for the kinds of organisms which emerged from water to form the line which would lead to the tetrapods. So the other thing to notice is, first of all, it's got a neck, so it can turn its head like this, which the fishes can't, none of the fishes can do. They also have a pelvis, a true pelvis, which is fused to the spine, again, as an adaptation for weight. So that these limbs that they had were weight-bearing, even if they were still partially supported by water or spent time in water. They don't appear to have had gills, but that is somewhat uncertain. So this is a primitive. This looks like a primitive tetrapod, a primitive four-limbed organism, which has arisen from the fish line, and it has arisen from the lobe-finned fish. Now that whole group, we have a rich fossil record for the groups which arose from them, from that kind of Tiktaalik ancestral grouping. And the most primitive of all of these are we still have many representatives still alive, and these are the Amphibia. So these are the salamanders and frogs, those kinds of organisms. And their whole lifestyle, their whole structure is a reflection of their continuing tie to aquatic habitats. Amphibia means two worlds. So they are terrestrial, but they're also aquatic. And they are tied to water for a number of reasons. The first is that they are fertilized in reproduction. Their fertilization is external. The female releases eggs, the male releases sperm over those eggs, just like the fish. Like most of the fish, I should say. The second thing is their larvae, the tadpoles, the eggs and then the tadpoles develop in water and have a requirement for water. There are a few very specialized amphibians which can actually move up onto land to reproduce, but they create a little aquatic environment in one way or another for their eggs and for their tadpoles to develop. So their development is tied to an aquatic environment. Those eggs have no resistance to desiccation. They will dry out really quickly if they were laid up on land. They have to be laid in the water. So what makes the egg so fragile in terms of drying out is it has no shell. It has a jelly-like covering, but it has no shell which would resist drying out. So here are all of the different kinds of amphibians. There are many of them. These are the salamanders, newts and salamanders, which have long bodies. And these are the order Anura, the frogs and toads. This is a very strange group of legless amphibians called the Caecilians. The whole group is called the Apoda, and they occur in tropical regions. Again, in very moist soil and in the leaf litter and that sort of thing in forests. So those are the Amphibia. We regard the Amphibia as being a primitive group of tetrapods. And the next important development in the story of the evolution of the tetrapods was that there was a development of an egg which would resist desiccation, would resist drying out when it was laid up on land. And this is called the amniotic egg. It is named for the membrane which comes to cover the developing embryo. So what this is doing is it's creating an aquatic environment inside, and this amniotic egg is usually protected by a set of other set of membranes and often a shell. And the egg is specifically designed to allow passage of oxygen and the expulsion of carbon dioxide, but it restricts the loss of water, so that it resists drying out. And this meant that the egg could be laid up on land. Not only that, the organisms that lay these eggs have internal fertilization. So they'll have a copulation, a mating, where the fertilization is internal, and then an egg would be laid. This amniotic structure, defined by the amnion, can also be elaborated on, as we'll see further down the line. This can be elaborated on. There are even reptiles, like snakes, for example, which don't lay their eggs. They actually bear them internally. They actually raise them internally. So there are all sorts of elaborations that can be made of this amniotic egg structure. So we'll see that for example, in the mammals, essentially we have this exact structure. We have the amnion and everything, but instead of being laid in a shell, this is carried inside in a uterus, and it actually forms a placenta which embeds in the uterus wall. Okay, so it's that whole live birth structure that we have is an elaboration on this amniotic situation. The movement up onto land was extremely complex because they had to adapt not only reproduction, but all sorts of other things as well. As soon as you move up onto land, you have to have systems which will resist gravity, which will allow you to locomote in opposition to gravity. When we go back to things like Tiktaalik, we see that these strong limb bones that have developed here are almost like a pre-adaptation, which would allow things to begin to move on land. Second of all, another thing which limits amphibians is that they have a moist skin, and in fact, their skin is used for respiration. That limits them in the kinds of habitats they can inhabit on dry land. But groups of tetrapods arose, which had dry skin. They did not have mucous membrane over the skin. They had dry skin. And with that, they developed much more advanced lung structures, much more advanced rib cage structures to enable them to breathe efficiently. If we have a look here at this grouping here rather, here's the ancestral amniot, okay? And we are now going to have a look as this whole group here arises. This whole grouping here are in fact linked to one another, and they are linked by the fact that they share an ancestor that laid an amniotic egg, and this has enabled this entire group to move deep into land and now to adapt to all of the habitats up in the terrestrial environment. So the first group, of course, to talk about is the class Reptilia. And the Reptilia, in some ways, when we look at them, we can see some ties to the Amphibia, especially in the way in which they locomote and in the stance that their skeleton adopts. What I mean by that is that the limbs tend in the reptiles to come out of the body at right angles. And then the bottom of the limb tends to be at right angles to that, to give it a square look as it stands. Now that was very advantageous in terms of locomoting on land initially, but it has a disadvantage. And the disadvantage in the reptile posture is that as the animal moves, its body sways, and one side of the body gets compressed, and then the other, and then the other. It swings from side to side like this, and it reduces the efficiency of the use of the lungs. And what we see in this whole group, the Reptilia, is a gradual advancement in locomotion and a gradual adoption of stance and of a mode of movement which frees up the lungs, which keeps the lungs open. This may have been one of the driving forces in the evolution of the dinosaurs that came up onto two legs. And one of the things about that was that now the lungs operated equally on either side. So the reptiles are divided into various groups. We think that one of the most ancient groups in actual fact are the turtles and the tortoises, which are, however, highly modified. The next group are called the Lipidosaurs, and those are the lizards, the snakes, and their allies. Then there's this group here, which are the Archosaurs. And the Archosaurs are a group which include the crocodiles and, surprisingly, the birds. And it would have included the dinosaurs if the dinosaurs had still been extant. The point is, though, that the dinosaurs, in fact, have in a way survived because we still have this Archosaur group, which are the birds, which are derived from their dinosaur ancestors. The most diverse groups are the squamata, the lizards and the snakes, and then this very successful group of the birds. Now you may sort of wonder at this inclusion of the birds in the reptiles, because there's things about them which make us think that maybe they should rather be closer to the mammals, right? For a start, they're warm-blooded. That evolution of warm-bloodedness has arisen several times in the vertebrate line. It has not only arisen once in the mammals. It is not a characteristic of the mammals alone. It has very probably arisen several times in the reptiles, and it has arisen independently in the birds. So that is not a characteristic. Instead, think of this with the birds. They lay eggs, first of all, and most reptiles lay eggs. Second of all, birds have scales, and scales are characteristic of the reptiles. They're an adaptation to the terrestrial environment to prevent drying out. And the birds have scales. Their feathers are modified scales. And look at their feet, and you'll see that their feet and legs are still scaled. They still have scales there. And the birds are, in fact, very close to the reptiles. And we probably should regard them as being advanced reptiles. The birds are such a fantastically successful group. And one thing, of course, which has granted them that, most birds, is their ability to fly. As soon as a group acquires the ability to fly, we often see a massive radiation because it takes them into so many different habitats, and it opens so many ecological niches for them. Then when we look at the birds, almost all of their adaptations are adaptations for flight. They are very, very light for their volume. They have hollow bones, for example. they have an incredibly efficient method of breathing, which is unique to the birds. We breathe in a tidal fashion. We breathe in and then we breathe out. So our breath is always a mixture. It's always a mixture of used gases and new gases. Birds don't do that. They have a system which is one way. They are always breathing in pure oxygen, using it and breathing out the waste without mixing in that fashion. These elaborate scales, which now form feathers, probably evolved as a way of regulating temperature. And only later became elaborated on as a locomotory mechanism. So we now come to this, our own group, the mammals. Many phylogenists regard the mammals as being very close to the reptiles. There is some argument about the ancestry, but the mammals are clearly a line of amniotes, and they appear to have arisen about 200 million years ago or so. They in fact arose at about the same time as there was at the start of the Mesozoic, when there was a flowering of the reptile groups that led to the dinosaurs. But the mammals remained as an obscure group because so many of the ecological niches were occupied by the fantastically diverse reptiles that were around them. So I should explain that there are certain characters which are derived, which define the mammals. And the first is that all mammals produce milk. Now, that is where the name comes from. Mammals have mammary glands. The degree of organization differs, as I'll show you in a minute. They all have hair, and they also all have a fat layer underneath the skin, which does not occur in the reptiles. They have a very high metabolic rate, and they maintain a constant internal body temperature. But that is not unique to the mammals. Similar characteristics have probably existed in several reptile groups and still exist in the birds. The one thing which characterizes the mammals and allows us to differentiate them from the reptiles, even when we look at very ancient reptile forms that may have been close to the mammals, is that the mammals have differentiated teeth. And mammals also have two sets of teeth. They have a juvenile set of teeth and then an adult set of teeth. The reptiles continually produce teeth. They have continual replacement of their teeth, and the teeth are all much the same. Now, there are three groups of mammals. These are the monotremes, the marsupials, and then the Euphyria. The Euphyria are the placental mammals, of which we are one. Here are the monotremes. They are remnants of a very ancient group, and we look at them and are able to visualize perhaps what a very primitive mammal looked like. Because these are mammals which actually lay eggs. There are two groups. The first is a group called the Echidnas, and the second are the ductal platypus. So these are the only remains of what was probably once a common feature of the primitive mammals, that they continue to lay eggs. They now occur only in Australia, New Guinea, and those areas. They also produce milk, but they don't have a mammary, they don't have a nipple, and they don't have a breast of any sort. Instead, these little glands, which are highly modified sebaceous glands in the skin, simply leak milk onto the surface and the young lap it up. The development of a breast structure and a nipple is a later development. The other group, which we regard as being relatively primitive mammals, are the marsupials. And the marsupials are things like the kangaroos and those sorts of kangaroos, opossums. Now, they share a lot of derived characters with the more advanced mammals, but they have maintained a primitive form of reproduction, and that is that they give birth very, very early on to what is effectively a fetus. They give birth to the fetus, which then makes its way to a pouch called the marsupium, where they fix themselves to a nipple. They actually kind of bond to the nipple, and they remain there for the rest of their embryonic development. And they then, once they're mature enough, they can spend some time in the pouch with the mother, and that's the familiar picture for us, the kangaroo with the little joey sticking its head out of. The marsupials used to be a very widespread, successful group, and they evolved. They occurred worldwide, especially in the southern hemisphere and Gondwana land, when the supercontinents still existed. They were then eclipsed by the later, more successful mammals, which were the Euphyria. And in one area of the world, that was Australia, the two groups, the Euphyria and the marsupials, drifted off from the rest of the continents. And then there was a competition between the Euphyria and the marsupials. And in that one area alone, the marsupials won out. And the Eupherians, which were actually the more advanced, they actually died out because the marsupials underwent an adaptive radiation and occupied all of the ecological niches. And they outcompeted the Euphyria, but only in that area, only in Australia. So that is why now when we go look at Australia and areas close by to it, we see such a diverse marsupial fauna. There are one or two marsupials which survived in the rest of the world, and our opossum is one of them. The opossums occur in South America and then up into North America as well. Okay, so our group, our own group, are called the Euphyria. We are also referred to as being the placental mammals. And this development of the placenta was a huge evolutionary advance. The placenta allows a lengthy development of the fetus internally in the female. And they tend then to have a longer pregnancy, but give birth to an infant, which is often much more advanced than in the primitive mammals. So we belong to a particular group, which are the primates. And the derived characters of the primates are that we all have grasping digits. We all have binocular vision. We all have a relatively large brain for our size, even in the monkeys, those sorts of things. And we all show a well-developed social structure with extended parental care of juveniles. Now, we, the humans, we belong to a genus called Homo. And Homo is a group who arose about 200,000 years ago as our species. But preceding our species, which is sapiens, preceding our species, there was a long and very, very diverse evolutionary history. There have been numerous species of Homo, all of which are now extinct. We are the only members of the genus who currently exist. But we are closely related to the other great apes in all sorts of ways. And this can be demonstrated quite easily by looking at our DNA. And our DNA suggests that we share enormous similarity, particularly with these two groups, the chimpanzees and the bonobos, but also with these other great apes as well. And our history has been a history of adopting, first of all, adopting upright stance. We are the only one in the great apes which have upright stance and bipedal locomotion as a permanent feature of our habit. The other apes are able to come up onto their hind legs, but are unable to locomote extended periods on hind legs. The second thing is that the human line has shown a development of the brain, and associated with that, the ability to make elaborate tools which are pre-planned, and also to form complex abstract thought. So we are going to have a look at all of these. Please now, will you go on to your computers and go to this link, follow this link here to this Howard Hughes Medical Institute exercise on human origins. And there is an activity sheet associated with it. Please have that completed and bring that to class, please, by Monday, February 21st. All right. I'm sorry, but the necessity for going through this material so quickly. I want to remind you, please, first of all, it's really important that you go to your texts and that you read enough to fill in some of the gaps and have a clearer picture. And the second thing is, please remember that the assignments which are being put up are there for various reasons, but importantly, to lead you through this material again, to help you revise, and again, to plump it out, to make it more comprehensible. A new assignment has gone up already for this week, so please go there and use that as part of your revision for next week's test. Next week's test takes you up to the end of today, okay? And next week's test is not on Monday, it is on the Wednesday. Even though it says it's on the calendar that it's Monday, in actual fact, it's on Wednesday, okay? And I will see you on Monday.